Because of the excellent cross-cutting facilities of the Triton Work Centre in the cross-cut mode, most of your cross-cutting should be done in that mode. However, there'll be instances where you want to do some cross-cutting and you're set up in the table saw mode, so you can do it on the Triton. What you do is you slide the MITRE gauge, the protractor, in this slot here. Always give it a bit of spray lubricant before starting work. Make sure it's nice and free to slide, like so. And in the first instance, we'll set the gauge at 0, lock off both knobs, and then position the workpiece. Holding the workpiece against the sandpaper face, which prevents slippage, preferably wrap your fingers around the front of the workpiece and tuck your thumb behind the upstand of the protractor. Now, in positioning this for the cut, be very careful to avoid having a small offcut which might fall down the slot beside the blade. Now, the range of offcut sizes that you're worried about are anything between about 1 millimetre and up to about 5 millimetres in width. Less than 1 millimetre, it'll be a paper-thin shaving and it'll fall harmlessly down between the blade and the slot. More than 5 millimetres and it'll sit comfortably on this side of the table. So avoid having an offcut which is going to be in that dangerous range between 1 and 5. In this instance, I'll create quite a generous offcut to do the cut. If you want to cut a smallish number of pieces the same length and you're in the table saw mode, you can do it in much the same way as you do it in the cross-cut mode. Rough cut them to length first, then line up the dressed ends, the outside ends away from the blade, get them dead in line, then hold them firmly together or tape them again if you wish, and then slide them through and make a smooth cut. Something I forgot to mention earlier, the use of a stick to flick your scraps away. It is much safer than reaching in and trying to pick them up with your fingers. Use a stick, much safer. What about cutting a wide piece? A piece which is normally too wide to fit between the MITRE gauge and the saw blade. For example, a piece like this. Now, by rights, this should be cut in the cross-cut mode. But if you've only got one piece to cut and you're set up in the table saw mode and you couldn't be bothered changing to the cross-cut mode, you can do it. I'll raise the safety guard a little bit to give me access. Now, I'm going to do a plunge cut, much the same way as I did a plunge cut in the cross-cut mode. Park the MITRE gauge as far back as it will go. Position your wood in there. Make sure it's clear of the blade before switching on. Sight up to a pencil line, which you've got there, for example, and then clear of the blade, switch on. Once you've had a bit of practice, well, perhaps more than a bit of practice with your work centre, you'll be able to do things like making parquetry and inlay work. For example, this table here. You'll have to cut a number of pieces, shortish pieces, to exactly the same length. And it's crucial that they be exactly the same length. Here's how it's done. Before showing you how it's done, perhaps I should show you how it's not done. There's a natural inclination among inexperienced Triton owners to run the wood against the MITRE gauge, the protractor. That's fine, but a lot of people think you set the fence as a stop. Now, that's extremely dangerous for this following reason. You've got your wood in there, you make the cut. Once you've made the cut, what happens? You've got an offcut trapped between the spinning blade and the fence, and it's not being controlled. If that offcut twists even slightly, it'll be flung out by the blade towards you and can cause a serious injury. So, what do? If you want to use a fence as a stop, then prepare a piece of packing material, reasonable thickness, say 19 millimetre, 3/4 inch. Move the fence out by that same amount. Let's say you wanted 120 mil pieces. Well, move it to 139 mil, allowing for the 19 mil of your packing piece. Excuse me. 139, 139, and clamp that little packing piece to the fence like so. You can butt the work up against the stop block, make the cut, and suddenly you've got this escape area here where the piece is not going to be trapped between the blade and the fence, and you can handle it properly. It won't get flung out towards you. While this method of repetition cutting is quite effective, it's not the best way. The problem with it is that although you're no longer trapping the offcut between the spinning blade and the fence, you've got some escape there, you're also not controlling it. Nothing's holding it in position. And you may find that some of the pieces will vibrate crookedly and may dance against the side of the saw blade and get slightly recut, which will show up in a parquetry or inlaid tabletop. So the best way is not to use the fence at all. Just remove the fence, but attach to your mitre gauge one of these jigs. Now let me just show it to you. It has a vertical upstand so you can put your screws in, and a fairly wide, thin leading face so that you can cut into it with your saw blade without weakening this face too badly. And then you have a little stop block which you can nail on at any position, and that will determine how long the pieces are that you'll be cutting. Very simply, put it in the slot, take your work, butt it against the stop. You can still use the safety guard, of course. You can now use your right hand on this side to hold it firmly against the block, and this is the action. If you're afraid of cutting too far into this board, what you can very simply do is decide the maximum travel that you want to achieve and then clamp with a G-clamp another block of wood to the table there to limit your travel. You can't go too far that way. As you'll recall from the crosscut section, mitre cutting is very easy on a Triton. You can, of course, do it in the table saw mode, and when making picture frames or cutting small pieces, it's probably better in the table saw mode. I've already explained how the mitre gauge works. The protractor, it has the two faces, exactly 90 degrees to each other, so that any error in setting, if you're on 44 3/4 degrees on this face, then this face will be 45 1/4 degree, and will always add up to 90. So use the two faces to get perfect mitres. Having said that, do try to get exactly on 45 degrees, or as close as you can, because the mitres won't match perfectly in the corner unless you are set that way. The holding position is basically the same as for cross-cutting. You hold the wood firmly and tuck your thumb behind. Now, when mitre cutting in the table saw mode, you always have the good face upwards, and that's for two reasons. Firstly, the uppermost face in the table saw mode is the face which gets the least splintering, so you want your good face up. And perhaps more importantly, resting moulding on its contoured, curved face doesn't give you a very good support base to rest on. So always cut it this way, and you'll see that by using face B, you can get your reverse angle mitre with no problems. Make your first cut on face A and your second cut on face B, like this. There, as you can see, the upper face is clean, and any splintering and tearing is on the back face, and it was cut very safely, resting on its flat bottom with its highest side against the face of the mitre gauge at all times. Now, when you're cutting a picture frame, you'll need to cut several pieces to exactly the same length. Having cut one piece to length, this end against face A and this end against face B, I can now use this as a master to set a stop for cutting the opposite piece of the frame. Very simply, it's done by attaching a wooden sub-fence to your mitre gauge, to face B of your mitre gauge, and preparing an angled stop block and a G-clamp. Then you place this piece against the sub-fence, push it in, touch the mitred face against the saw blade, don't deflect the blade, and then you can just move the stop block into position, and that'll give you your exact length. Just touch it lightly against the piece. Make sure you're not jamming in there. Now you can take that away and take another piece which I've pre-prepared. I've already cut it on face A. Now I have to do face B. So I butt the face A piece in. And these two pieces are, of course, exactly the same length. Similarly, take one of your shorter pieces, cut one end on face A, the other end on face B. Again, park your protractor in position, touch the wood against the side of the blade lightly, move the stop block in, again lightly, clamp it in position, and then you can very easily cut your second piece, and that will also be the same length. If you use this method to cut all of your mitres for picture framing, one end on face A, one end on face B, and if you use a stop block, you won't have to measure and mark, and you won't have to worry about gaping mitres. It'll always match perfectly, and your frames will be perfectly square with perfect corners. All of the mitres you've seen so far have involved 45-degree angles, but you can have any angle that you like as long as the two angles add up to 90 degrees to give you a right angle. For example, I've set the protractor here at 30 degrees, so the piece cut on face A will be at 30 degrees, and the piece cut on face B will be at 60 degrees. Well, 30 plus 60 equals 90. You've still got the problem there, of course, that this piece is wider than that on the angle. So you can either start off with narrower material or rip that down to size. The mortise and tenon joint, arguably one of the most difficult and time-consuming joints to make in woodworking by hand, but as you'll see in a moment, the tenon is very simple to make on the Triton with your saw, and the mortise is very easy if you have a router. A word of advice when planning this joint, always make your mortises first. The reason being that ideally a mortise should be made with one pass of the router rather than one pass and then another smaller pass, because that way you'll have problems keeping everything central. Make your mortises, say 13 millimetres wide, as in this case here, and then, when it comes to making your tenons, what you have to do is be left with 13 millimetres of tenon standing from the end of your wood. So set the saw blade so that in two cuts, you'll have 13 millimetres left from the material you started off with. You'll be doing one cut from this face and one cut from this face. Now you can again set the fence as a stop because there's no solid offcut being created, just some sawdust, and set the fence as a stop, allowing for your saw blade thickness so that the tenon that you get ends up being slightly less than the depth of your mortise. Sandpaper override on the front of the mitre gauge so I can do the clean-up by sliding the wood sideways, and tenoning is as easy as this. Hold the wood against the gauge, check that it's nice and square to the fence. Fence is locked, blade is set to the right height, away we go. As you can see, that tenon must be perfectly central on the end of the wood and perfectly square, and then just round off the corners and fit it into your mortise. Hopefully this is a good fit. There we go. As you've seen, face B of the mitre gauge is an extremely useful adjunct to your work centre. It can be used for cutting sharper angles than 45 degrees and also can be used for ripping short tapers. Let me show you. In this instance, I've got an extension fence mounted to face B. I've got a stop block set up there. And I'm going to cut a picket for a picket fence, for example. If you're working with very long pieces, of course, you can do all of this in the cross-cut mode where you don't move the wood, but this is a short piece, so I'll do it in the table saw mode. I've lined up my saw blade with the center line of this piece of wood and use this as my standard, and then two cuts. And there's a 60-degree angle formed at the top of my picket. There are a couple of excellent ways of ripping tapers on a Triton, both long tapers and short tapers, and I stress again, you do not do it by angling the fence to the blade. What you do is you use face B of the MITRE gauge again with an extender and a stop block. Now, I've got this set of 15 degrees, and I will find if I try to do this cut that I won't be able to move the MITRE gauge far enough to complete the cut. Well, for these sort of cuts, you may move the saw forward to the forward lock position. Unlock the table, slide the chassis forward, lock it back in, double check that it's locked, and you can reposition the guard forward or completely relocate it forward, but I've got enough protection there. Lower the safety guard, like so. Okay, now I've got my piece firmly against the stop block, and I can keep my fingers clear, well out of the line of the path of the blade. As you can see, I just ran out of travel, but there's my short taper. I have to clean that piece off. And of course, it's an excellent way of making your own wedges as well. Let's say you're working with long work pieces, too long to comfortably use an extension fence and a stop block in the table saw mode. Well, you can do this in a cross-cut mode, where you don't move the wood, you move the saw. But if they're manageable pieces, no more than, say, 1.8 meters or 6 foot long, you can do them in the table saw mode this way. Take all of your work pieces and mark a reference line, a known distance back from that edge, say 100 millimeters, and do the same on the other face of the material. Then take one of your pieces only and make a pencil line showing the halfway point of that piece, assuming, of course, that you want a symmetrical picket. Okay, now put this into against your MITRE gauge. Set the MITRE gauge in position until the saw blade is directly opposite that pencil line, and then translate your reference line up the face of the MITRE gauge, like so. Translate that up. You can then make your first cut, then turn the wood over, compare the reference line to the pencil line, and make your second cut, and all of your pickets will be symmetrical. Another safety issue. In this cut, you don't have the sandpaper to stop the wood from slipping, nor do you have a stop block. So you'll have to hold the work very firmly against the MITRE gauge extension fence, or put some sandpaper on it if you wish, or you could even consider clamping them together. And preferably, work from around this side, keep your hands clearly in view, rehearse the cut if necessary, and make sure your fingers don't come anywhere near the line of the saw blade. The secret of taper ripping is that while you move the workpiece parallel to the saw blade, there's nothing to say that you can't angle the workpiece itself. You may recall that thumbtack example given when squaring up a large sheet earlier in this video. How do you angle the workpiece? Well, very simply, if you've built this repetition ripping jig, which we showed you earlier, then you can modify that, make it a two-part jig, where you recess a hinge in there and put another straight piece on to the main body of the repetition ripping jig. Here, a slotted adjustment arm, so you can change the angle to whatever you want. I'll set that on my predetermined angle. And here we have a stop block, again, angled face to hold the wood down, and that actually pushes the workpiece through past the blade. Now, it can get a little bit confusing if you've never done any taper ripping to know exactly the line of the saw blade. So what I recommend is that you get your piece of wood, put it in position, take a straight edge, and extend the line of the saw blade and the riving knife, and just make a pencil mark on your wood, right there. Then you can rehearse this cut. You can rehearse your finger position. I'll be holding it right here and right there, pushing it against the block, and then sliding it through, like this. And there's my taper.